The American presidency operates under a constitutional framework that very few people actually understand in its totality. We have this mechanism, the 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, which emerged from the chaos surrounding Kennedy's assassination and the questions it raised about presidential incapacity. What it establishes is a formal process by which a sitting president can be removed from office not through impeachment, not through electoral defeat, but through a determination of inability to discharge the powers and duties of the office. Now we're witnessing something extraordinary unfold in real time. Reports are circulating about behavioral incidents, about statements made in unscripted moments, about concerns being raised within the executive branch itself about decision-making capacity and temperament. This isn't about partisan preference or ideological disagreement. This is about the structural vulnerability of concentrating enormous power in a single individual without adequate institutional safeguards for assessing ongoing fitness. The 25th Amendment requires the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to initiate this process, which means we're talking about people appointed by the President himself potentially making a determination about his capacity to govern. Think about the power dynamics at play here, the loyalty structures, the career implications, the constitutional crisis that could emerge. What we're really examining is whether American political institutions can self-correct when faced with questions about executive stability, or whether the concentration of power in the modern presidency has made such accountability mechanisms effectively inoperable. The history of presidential power in the United States has always been a story of expansion, consolidation, and the periodic failure of checks and balances to function as originally intended. When the framers designed the executive branch, they were terrified of monarchy, terrified of tyranny, yet they also recognized the need for decisive leadership in times of crisis. What they created was a compromise, and like all compromises in political economy, it contained within it the seeds of its own contradictions. The presidency has grown far beyond what Madison or Hamilton could have imagined, not through constitutional amendment in most cases, but through the gradual accumulation of emergency powers, the expansion of executive agencies, the creation of the national security state, and the transformation of the United States into a global military and economic hegemon. Every president inherits this apparatus, this machinery of power that operates across hundreds of agencies, commands military forces in dozens of countries, influences economic policy that affects billions of people, and makes decisions that can literally end human civilization through nuclear war. And we place all of this in the hands of one individual, elected through a process that is itself deeply flawed, heavily influenced by corporate money, and increasingly disconnected from popular will through the peculiarities of the electoral college system. What we're witnessing now is not unprecedented in the sense that concerns about presidential fitness have emerged before. Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke in 1919, and his wife Edith essentially ran the executive branch for months while this fact was hidden from Congress and the American people. Franklin Roosevelt's declining health in his final term was known to insiders, but concealed from the public. Ronald Reagan's cognitive decline in his second term has been documented by historians and even acknowledged by some of his former staff members. Richard Nixon, during the final days of Watergate, was reportedly drinking heavily and talking to portraits on the White House walls. The difference now is the velocity of information, the impossibility of containing these narratives, and the fact that we're living in an era where geopolitical tensions are arguably higher than they've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The stakes of having someone in that office who may not be capable of processing complex information, managing their emotional responses, or maintaining the kind of steady judgment required for crisis management are exponentially higher than they were in previous eras. The 25th Amendment emerged from a specific historical moment of anxiety about exactly these questions. After Kennedy was shot, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in within hours, but the nation had spent those hours in constitutional limbo. What if Kennedy had survived but been incapacitated? Who would have made decisions? What if there had been a simultaneous crisis requiring immediate executive action? The amendment was designed to create clarity, but in practice it has proven to be almost impossible to invoke against a sitting president who resists it. Section 4, which is what people are discussing now, requires the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare in writing to the leaders of Congress that the President is unable to discharge his duties. The President can then submit his own declaration that no inability exists, which immediately returns him to power unless the Vice President and Cabinet reassert their position, at which point Congress has 21 days to decide the matter, requiring a two-thirds vote in both chambers to keep the President removed. Think about the political dynamics this creates. We're asking political appointees, people whose careers depend on presidential favor, people who were chosen specifically because of their loyalty and alignment with the President's agenda, to essentially stage what would be perceived as a coup by the President's supporters. The economic implications of this kind of political instability are profound and often underestimated by commentators who focus purely on the constitutional mechanics. Global financial markets operate on confidence, on predictability, on the belief that contracts will be honored and that policy will follow some comprehensible logic. American Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment in the world, not because of anything inherent in pieces of paper, but because of faith in the stability and continuity of American political institutions. When that faith is shaken, when international observers begin to question whether the person commanding the world's largest military and controlling access to the world's reserve currency is making rational decisions, the consequences ripple through every economy on Earth. We saw this in miniature during various Trump administration policy announcements that came via social media without consultation with advisors, causing market volatility and forcing central banks and finance ministers around the world to develop strategies for responding to American policy that might be reversed hours later. Now imagine that dynamic intensified. Imagine scenarios where military action is being contemplated, or where trade negotiations critical to global supply chains are being conducted by someone whose judgment is genuinely impaired. The Cabinet itself is a fascinating institution to examine in this context because it has evolved so far from its original conception. These were meant to be the President's closest advisors, people of independent stature and expertise, who would provide counsel and serve as a check on executive impulses. In practice, particularly in recent administrations of both parties, the Cabinet has become increasingly subordinate, increasingly filled with loyalists rather than experts, increasingly unwilling or unable to push back against presidential decisions. The economic advisors who might have once argued against tariffs that violate basic principles of trade theory remain silent or are dismissed. The military advisors who might have once counseled restraint in the use of force are bypassed through the creation of parallel decision-making structures. The attorneys general who might have once provided independent legal judgment are expected to function as the President's personal lawyers. This transformation of the Cabinet from a body of counselors to a collection of subordinates makes the 25th Amendment mechanism even more difficult to invoke. Because we're asking people who have been selected for their unwillingness to challenge the President to suddenly find the courage and conviction to declare him unfit. There's a deeper systemic issue here that goes beyond any individual president or any particular incident on a tarmac. We have constructed a political economy in which enormous power is concentrated at the top, in which democratic accountability mechanisms have been weakened through the influence of corporate money and the decline of civic institutions, and in which the psychological and emotional demands placed on the individuals who occupy these positions of power are extraordinary. The American presidency is not a job designed for human beings in the normal sense. The cognitive load of processing information from dozens of agencies on hundreds of simultaneous issues, the emotional strain of making life and death decisions, the physical exhaustion of the schedule, the psychological isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who want things from you and who are constantly managing their interactions with you for advantage. We take individuals, often people in their 60s or 70s, and we subject them to this environment, and then we act surprised when they show signs of stress, cognitive decline, or emotional instability. The military and intelligence apparatus adds another layer of complexity to this situation. The President has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. There is no institutional check on this power, no required consultation with Congress, no mandatory cooling-off period. From the moment a decision is made to the time missiles are in the air can be measured in minutes. This system was designed during the Cold War based on the assumption that a Soviet first strike might leave only minutes for response, and it has never been updated despite the complete transformation of the geopolitical landscape. So we have a situation where someone who may be experiencing emotional dysregulation, who may be making decisions based on perceived personal slights or domestic political considerations rather than actual national security threats, has the unilateral power to initiate a nuclear exchange that would kill hundreds of millions of people and potentially end human civilization. The people around the president, the military officers who would carry out these orders, the cabinet members who might be consulted, they all operate within a chain of command that emphasizes obedience and speed of execution. The safeguards we imagine exist are largely informal, based on norms and personal courage rather than institutional structures. The political tribalism of the current moment makes invoking the 25th Amendment even more unthinkable for those who would need to initiate it. We live in an era of negative partisanship, where political identity has become fused with personal identity in ways that override other considerations. A cabinet member who participated in removing a president would be branded a traitor by tens of millions of people. They would face death threats. Their families would be harassed. Their careers in politics would be over. Their names would become synonymous with betrayal in the right-wing media ecosystem. And for what? To elevate the vice president who shares most of the same policy positions and who would face immediate questions about their own legitimacy. The political incentives all push toward inaction, toward minimizing concerning behavior, toward explaining away incidents that in any other context would be disqualifying. This is how institutions fail, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the gradual normalization of the abnormal, through the collective decision to look away from things that require uncomfortable action. The international dimension of this crisis potential cannot be ignored. America's allies have spent the better part of a decade trying to develop strategies for dealing with unpredictable American leadership. European nations have discussed creating independent military capabilities because they can no longer rely on NATO commitments. Asian allies have quietly explored their own nuclear options because they question the reliability of the American security umbrella. Middle Eastern partners have diversified their relationships and made deals with Russia and China that would have been unthinkable during previous eras of American dominance. All of this represents a fundamental shift in global power structures that has been accelerated by perceptions of American political instability. When the Secretary of State travels abroad now, foreign leaders are calculating whether agreements made today will survive tomorrow's presidential social media outburst. When military commanders coordinate with American forces, they are wondering whether the rules of engagement might change based on domestic political pressures in the United States. This erosion of trust in American consistency and reliability is perhaps the most significant geopolitical shift of the past decade, and it is directly connected to questions about leadership stability. The economic nationalist policies that have emerged in recent years are both a cause and consequence of this broader institutional crisis. Tariffs imposed, apparently on impulse, trade agreements abandoned without replacement, relationships with critical economic partners damaged over symbolic issues. All of this reflects a decision-making process that is divorced from the kind of careful analysis that characterized American foreign economic policy during the post-war era. Now, you can disagree with the neoliberal consensus that governed trade policy for decades. You can argue that it benefited corporations at the expense of workers, and there's substantial evidence for that position, but the alternative cannot be chaos. It cannot be policy made through overnight decisions without consultation with the industries and workers who will be affected. The harm done to American manufacturing through sudden tariff policies that disrupted supply chains and raised input costs demonstrates that erratic decision-making, regardless of its ideological direction, produces bad outcomes for ordinary people. The media's role in all of this deserves examination because the incentive structures of modern journalism have made it nearly impossible to have sustained serious conversation about presidential fitness. Everything is reduced to conflict, to outrage, to the generation of clicks and views. A concerning behavioral incident becomes content for a 24-hour news cycle and then disappears, replaced by the next controversy, the next outrageous statement, the next crisis. There is no institutional memory, no sustained investigation, no framework for connecting individual incidents into a pattern that might require systemic response. The financial model of journalism rewards sensationalism over analysis, breaking news over context, hot takes over thoughtful examination. So we get endless speculation and very little actual reporting on the mechanisms that might be employed, the legal standards that might apply, or the historical precedents that might inform our understanding. We get personalities yelling at each other on cable news and very little actual journalism about how the 25th Amendment has been discussed within previous administrations, what the threshold for invocation should be, or how other democracies handle questions of executive incapacity. The broader crisis of American democracy is the context in which all of this is happening. We have a system in which the majority of the population feels unrepresented by either political party, in which trust in institutions has collapsed to historically low levels, in which the basic mechanisms of democratic accountability like voting rights and fair representation are being systematically undermined in many states, and in which economic inequality has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Into this volatile mixture, we inject questions about whether the sitting president is psychologically and cognitively capable of performing his duties, and the potential for serious political crisis becomes obvious. If the 25th Amendment were invoked, millions of people would see it as an illegitimate coup regardless of the evidence. If it is not invoked despite clear evidence of incapacity, millions of people would lose even more faith in the ability of institutions to function. There is no clean resolution here, no procedural fix that will satisfy everyone or restore confidence in the system. What we need, ultimately, is a fundamental rethinking of how we structure executive power in a democracy. No single individual should have the kind of unchecked authority that the modern American president possesses. The expansion of presidential power has occurred through emergency after emergency, crisis after crisis, each one leaving behind new authorities that are never relinquished. We need to rebuild the institutional checks that have eroded, to restore genuine congressional oversight, to create structures of accountability that do not depend on the personal courage of appointed officials, but are built into the system itself. We need to address the cognitive and psychological demands we place on our leaders and create support structures that recognize them as human beings, subject to the same limitations as everyone else. Most fundamentally, we need to democratize decision-making so that the fate of the nation and the world does not rest on the mental state of one individual on any given day. Until we address these structural issues, we will continue to face these crises, regardless of who occupies the office or which party controls the government.